Hello and welcome to Catholicism and You on Lumen Christi Television Network, a program which focuses on questions bordering your mind on Catholicism. I am Reverend Father Cath You Epsd. As we know, the essence of the Church is to direct the course of man towards the right path. That brings us to another segment of our program. We begin today with a question from a viewer. Are the general intercessions the same as the prayer of the faithful? And who writes this? The simple answer to the first part of the question is yes. But historical background might help. The phrase prayer of the faithful was used to distinguish these prayers as being said by the already baptized as opposed to the catechumens who were not yet among the faithful and hence were not present for these prayers. The more common term today is general intercessions, which signifies that these are prayers for the whole world and it includes the church at large. The structure of the prayer that we commonly use at Mass contains an introduction by the priest, a variation with "Let us pray," not itself a prayer to God, the statement of petitions and the congregation's response, and a concluding prayer by the priest. Classically, it was a deacon who announces the intentions, because it was he who knew the particular needs of the community since he worked closely to them. He knew who needed food, charity, who was sick, and who had died, and so forth. By exercising this liturgical role, he reflects his ministry outside the Mass and thereby exemplified the unity of worship and Christian living. As for who writes the general intercession, there can be a number of answers. The introduction to the lectionary states that the deacon, another minister, or some of the faithful may propose intentions that are short and phrased with a measure of flexibility. Article 30. What is envisioned here is the involvement of the assembly in articulating petitions, whether spoken or written down. Some parishes enlist the aids of some lay people in preparing the petitions in liturgical planning, and this is done in their liturgical planning meetings. Others have a box for people to drop them off as they enter the church on Sunday, and some assign the task of composing them to committees. Sometimes, however, for the sake of convenience, the prayer of the faithful is written by the priest or the deacon. Certainly, the letter of the recommendations in the lectionary introduction and the spirit of the prayer as the prayer of the faithful would seem to invite participation of the faithful in preparing these prayers. The appendix on the sacramentary includes several sets of sample intercession that coincide with the liturgical season. There are very helpful models for the general intercession. Normally, these prayers concern the needs of the church, the nations or world, the sufferings for any particular reason, the sick, and finally the disease. Generally speaking, the more universal and general this prayer is, the better. Hence, the prayer for the nation, world, and so forth, but for more specifically, it is the naming of the sick and the disease of the particular community, the better. That means when the prayer is all-encompassing, is good. And at certain points, it must also reflect the intentions of the community, because it reflects certain communities that gathered for the liturgy. But even here, The style of prayer is inclusive of individuals and all who are sick and all who have died. In conclusion, one can say the concluding prayer is done by the priest, since the content of the prayer is not specific or specified. The same creativity is composing the petition would also be encouraged here, inasmuch as we do not discourage creativity, but the common good must always be put into consideration. Recollect actual. Why do we collect actual gifts for the poor at masses only? I think the reader is trying to ask why we collect actual gifts at mass only during Thanksgiving. I suppose the simple answer to this question is custom. But as custom of a relatively recent vintage, it is really only been seen since Vatican II that Thanksgiving Day has caught on as a day to celebrate the Eucharist. In fact, in recent years, I have heard priests say that this should be a holy day of obligation because it does what holy days originally did in Europe: gather the people for Mass on a holy day. Also, I suspect that many parishes experience a high level of active participation at Thanksgiving Day Mass because the assembly is an intentional community. People who want to be there and who often share in many of the parish ministries. Therefore, it is not surprising that on the faithful day of a special Thanksgiving, we would remember the poor, the hungry, by collecting actual gifts for them. More so, this was among the earliest liturgical tradition of the church to collect food for the needy as they presented the food to be used for the Eucharist. The custom died out as its place was taken by collecting monetary gifts. But again, the origin of this custom was to share our bounty with those in need. The general instruction of the Roman Missa reflects some of these practices when it states that the preparation of gifts is the time to receive money or gifts for the church or the poor, brought by the faithful or collected by the Mass. Number 49. What this clearly underscores here is that the association of Eucharistic gifts with serving the poor and the needy. The parish implements what is envisioned by collecting the gifts in the church on a regular basis, indicating the community care for the less fortunate. In addition to the directives for the evening Mass of the Lord's Supper on Holy Thursday, states that at the beginning of the liturgy of the Eucharist, there may be a procession of the faithful with gifts for the poor. This is significant statement because on the most solemn night, when we commemorate the institution of the Eucharist, the Church asks that we unite our liturgy, our liturgical service, with the service of the poor. Hence, whether it is Thanksgiving, Holy Thursday, a Sunday Eucharist, the link between sharing the Eucharistic gift and the food for the poor is part of our tradition. The association should be upheld as a key value and a concrete expression of what the Mass signifies. Where does the collection money go, and how much should be put into the collection at Mass? In answering the previous, I cited the directive of the Missal, which indicates that the money is collected for the church and the poor. This suggests that the financial contribution you make go for parish expenses, for instance, staff salaries, education expenses, plant maintenance, and so forth. And whatever is designated for social justice concern. with regards to how much you should contribute. I can offer the biblical admonition about tithing and a broader notion of what you might give the community. In biblical terms, for instance, Deuteronomy chapter 14 verse 22, the notion of tithing means that people were expected to give 10% of what they earned from their land. A rather strict interpretation of this injunction still implies today in some Christian churches, especially among Baptists, as opposed to the custom where Catholics customarily give lesser sum. Part of the reason is that when civil government oversaw the support of the church, especially in parts of Europe, this meant that the faithful were relied upon less and less for church support. Therefore, their giving habits adjusted accordingly. In recent years, the Catholic Church has sought to frame the discussion on what we give to the church community in terms of stewardship. This means that what we have been given is ours only in the sense that we are free to choose what to do with for the common good. Part of stewardship is obviously money. Part of what we have been given for the common good concerns our God-given gifts and talents, which are also to be shared with others. We speak about the 3 T's: the time, the talent, and treasure. These express the insight that what we have been given should be shared freely and joyfully with others. One way that some parishes help people explore the ways they can offer their talent is to publicize the range of tasks that can be done by numbers of people: education, admiration, home visiting, legislative advocacy, liturgical ministry, to mention but a few. In this way, the limited focus of how much in terms of dollars shifts to appreciating what is mine and that which belongs to us. That as a member of the church, I am to share what I am and what I have with others. But now, giving back to your own original question and getting back to your own original question, how much? A priest friend of mine advises parishioners to start with what they can receive as an hour's wage. That is starting point for evaluating what they might consider giving as they work towards the biblical injunction of 10% of what they have and what they can give. We shall now quickly go for a short break, and when we return, we shall entertain more questions. Stay back.
By the truth about God who created and redeemed us, by the truth about the human person made in the image and likeness of God, destined for a glorious fulfillment in the kingdom to come. Always be convincing witnesses to the truth. Stir into flame the gift of God that has been bestowed upon you in baptism. Light your nation, light the world with the power of that flame. Amen.
Welcome back, still on Catholicism and You. Right before the break, we were tackling the question, where does the collection money go? And How much should be put into the collection? Still on Lumen Christi television network. A reader is asking, what kind of things should be included in the offertory procession? We used to bring up the host and water and wine. Now we don't sometimes bring up the water. Why? According to the general instruction of the Roman Missa, the gifts that the faithful are to present, the bread and wine, and money or other gifts for the church or the poor, should be brought by the faithful. Article number 49. Notice that it states precisely that the Eucharistic gifts are bread and wine, not water. The rationale here is that these food are the results of human labor, harvesting, productivity, and manufacture. These are the central of our acts of self-giving, because even though we usually do not bake the Eucharistic bread or produce the Eucharistic wine, as once was customary and expected, nevertheless, the gifts reflect the end result of human manufacture and labor. Labor brought to the liturgy as a sign of our dedication and willingness to give our talents for the sake of others. Behind this act of presenting the bread and wine within the church is the liturgical principle that we consume during communion the sacred host at Mass being celebrated, that only if necessary we should use host from the tabernacle for distribution. The historical background here is that while this was the norm and custom through the Middle Ages, when the laity came to receive communion less and less, the emphasis for the Mass to be valid was placed on the priest receiving communion from the bread and the wine consecrated at Mass. This was ratified and solidified by the liturgy and the liturgical teaching of the Council of Trent. However, as early as the middle of 18th century, the popes, beginning with Benedict XVI, began insisting that all communion to be received was consecrated at its Mass. The reason was not just a liturgical nicety. He was concerned that if this did not occur, the sacrifice of the Mass would be seen as separate from the communion Mass. And our theology taught that these were inseparable. Sacrifice and sacrament were one act that together were essential parts of the Mass. It was Pope Pius XII who reiterated this in modern times. The general instruction for Roman Missa summarizes this teaching and practice when it says, "It is most desirable that the faithful receive the Lord's body from hosts consecrated at the same Mass, and that in instances when it is permitted, they share in the chalice. Then, even through the sign, communion will stand out more clearly as sharing in the sacrifice actually being offered," as you see in number 56 of that same work. Is the term offertory still proper to us to use today? The reader is asking that he seems to recall in the former Mass that the offertory took much longer and had many more prayers and gestures. What happened? Your question is very well phrased, because you use what was the proper term according to theology and the Mass of Trent, the Council of Trent. But isn't any longer the Mass is not longer now. Let me try to explain. Much of the controversies regarding the Mass at the time of the Reformation focused on the concept of sacrifice. Debate raged over whether or not the Mass was a sacrifice. How could it be so? Whether the sacrifice of the Mass repeated or added anything to Christ's sacrifice on Calvary. In light of this dispute, the Bishop of the Council of Trent were very clear to state that the Mass was a sacrifice. A common phrase that was used after Trent to describe the link between Calvary and the Mass was that the Mass was the unbloody sacrifice of Calvary. Because the Catholic Church found itself so concerned about emphasizing sacrificial nature of the Mass after the Council of Trent, it thought that the three principal parts of the Mass were offertory, the consecration, and the communion. When these terms were specified, they were interpreted to mean that we offer bread and wine at the offertory, that at the consecration they were changed into the body and blood of Christ, and that after the priest received communion, the sacrament and the sacrifice of the Mass were made valid because these three actions had taken place. That's why the common understanding in the former rites of the Mass was that you committed no mortal sin if you arrive at Mass in time for offertory. In the reverse Missal, you no longer read about the offertory as this part of Mass. In the general instruction of the Roman Missal, it's called the preparation of the gift. In the actual text of the offertory of the Mass, in the Missal, this rite is called the preparation of the altar and the gifts. This change in terminology signals a change in understanding that the purpose of this rite is to lead to the Eucharistic prayer, not to diminish its prominence in any way. Whatever rites are associated with presenting bread and wine should be understood as preparatory for the transformation of the gift that takes place in the consecration during the Eucharistic prayer. You are quite right, therefore, that in former Mass, the offertory was longer and had more ceremony. In fact, the priest raised up the host and the chalice at this point, the way he did during the Eucharistic prayers. He also said 5 prayers that echoed much of the theology of the Roman canon. The present rite is much more specific and focuses on placing the gift on the altar table. The general instruction states that in preparation of the gift, the bread and wine are brought to the altar, number 41, section 1. What is interesting is that it also states it is desirable for the faithful to present the bread and the wine which are accepted by the priest or the deacon, number 49. Hence, the emphasis is placed on both people and the priest at the part of the Mass, and the rite is viewed as a simple transition to the proclamation of the Eucharistic prayer. Now you may ask, is the term offertory or offering obsolete? Not really. In fact, what occurs in the present revision of the Mass is that the verb form we offer is found in some form or other in every Eucharistic prayer in the Roman canon used from the early church through today. It states, "We offer to you, God of glory and majesty, this holy and perfect sacrifice." This phrase refers to the consecrated bread and wine. Now become the one perfect sacrifice, the very paschal mystery of Christ himself. When we say we offer These gifts will signify that it is once offered and unique sacrifice of Christ that we offer to the Father through Christ himself in the unity of the Holy Spirit. The more traditional place for the prayer of offering is here at the very section of the canon and the other Eucharistic prayer. We therefore, where we commemorate Christ's dying, singing, ascension, intercession on our behalf at the right hand of the Father. In summary, we present these gifts as we prepare the altar. We offer them as a sacrifice of Christ himself to the Father in the Eucharist. We draw the curtain on this episode to a close. Just to remind us, if there are questions, clarifications, suggestions you want to contribute, you can always send your inputs to the numbers on the screen, or you send it to the emails appearing on the screen. Till we meet again, I am Reverend Father Panaki Ogbede. God bless you.